forward button. Thank you, Amalia, for that incredibly kind introduction. If we did have, of course, perfect summer weather, we would probably also have half the audience. So I personally am a big fan of the Copenhagen weather. This is perfect for a lecture. In 2020, as has been mentioned, we saw a global wave of iconoclasm, a word that literally means the destruction of statues, across former imperial powers and their former colonial possessions, from the US and the UK to Canada, South Africa, the Caribbean, India, Bangladesh, New Zealand, and of course, right here in Denmark. Black Lives Matter protesters defaced and hauled down statues of slaveholders, Confederates, and imperialists, particularly. And there did come a point where so many were coming down that it seemed like almost any statue was a target. Even here in Copenhagen, the Little Mermaid was tagged with the words "racist fish" in graffiti. And there was a lot of confusion after this happened about how the Little Mermaid could possibly be construed as racist. Personally, I think the graffiti is best read as a joke rather than a very serious comment. But there is perhaps a serious point here, which I'm sure we'll come back to, which is that statues often come to symbolize quite different things than their creators intended. The Little Mermaid is vandalized very often, as I'm sure you know, and it's not vandalized because it's a mermaid. People don't actually have feelings about the fish being racist. The reason it's vandalized is because it is a hyper-visible public symbol and it functions as a national symbol. It's immediately recognizable around the world as a symbol of this city and a symbol of this country. So to vandalize it, you will immediately get a great deal of attention for whichever cause you wish. So I think it's the visibility of that statue rather than the subject that really matters. Now, when this sort of great wave of iconoclasm was happening in 2020, certainly in the US and UK, but also in some other countries, the US and UK had Republican and Conservative administrations at that point, which took this as an opportunity to stoke what is called a culture war. Effectively, this symbolizes the kind of conflict between perhaps sort of progressive values and traditional values, a sort of binary construct. And these Republican and Conservative administrations positioned themselves as the last defenders of American and British civilization against barbarism, political correctness, and what they increasingly called wokeness. This particular word, woke, has a lot of sway in the debate in the UK in particular. It's actually a word that originated in African American vernacular English as a rather tongue-in-cheek expression that sort of, were you alive to issues of social justice? Were you woke? This has now been completely co-opted in the UK particularly to mean what political correctness used to mean, which is really just sort of being right on and left wing if those don't sound like contradictory terms. And these governments reacted very strongly. They threatened funding cuts in the US and the UK to museums who removed statues or changed their displays. Now, of course, museums change their displays all the time, but suddenly this became highly politicized. And for any individual who would damage a statue, both in the US and UK, the governments drew up legislation to impose 10-year prison terms for any damage to a statue. Now, previously, the law had entailed that you could it mattered a lot what sort of damage you did and how much the damage cost to rectify, but those limits were removed completely. So any damage to a statue at all could mean 10 years in prison. Now, you might think at this point, really, are statues this big a deal? We have lots of problems in our societies, a cost of living crisis, all sorts of things. Could statues really be this important? And many of us will walk past statues every day without really thinking about them, who they are, or what they mean. Now, we've already heard a little about the famous case in Copenhagen, the bust case of Frederick V, which was, of course, taken from the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts and thrown into the harbour by a group of artists who filmed themselves performing the act. And there was great outrage after this, but I think a really crucial point is that the bust was missing for several weeks before anyone even noticed that it had gone. So actually, it was quite invisible for a lot of time. The Austrian writer Robert Musil, writing much earlier in the 20th century, once said, "There is nothing in this world as invisible as a monument." And I think perhaps this case proves him out. But clearly, statues do matter, because when they're pulled down, world leaders take their time to proclaim these very extreme measures to protect them. So obviously, they are very important to our societies in some way. And I was very frustrated by the debate that was happening in 2020 around these. The same lines were repeated again and again. And, it's very sort of narrow culture war binary. That pulling statues down was a way of erasing history, that you can't judge the past by the standards of the present, that destroying statues is what ISIS and the Taliban do, and, there's no other possible destruction of art that could be possible, that it's a slippery slope. Where will it stop? When, are we just going to end up with no statues at all? These sort of discussions went on again and again. And I thought it was very important from the point of view of, history and public history and public art to inform this debate and really place it in a historical context. So in the book, Amalia mentioned, I've looked at cases of statues being pulled down around the world for about the last 250 years, including George III's statue being pulled down at the beginning of the American Revolution in 1776 in New York, British colonial statues in India staying up for a surprisingly long time after the end of the British period, and Edward Colston, the slave trader, being thrown into the harbour in Bristol. And I do want to acknowledge here as well, we've heard a bit about it today, but the wonderful work here of Mathias Danbolt and Amalia Skumula. My Danish pronunciation is not great, but I really respect her work at the University of Copenhagen, particularly this Moving Monuments project, which I think is really fascinating and a really interesting way to move forward and address some of these issues. We're working in slightly different contexts, but clearly we're working along very similar lines, and I'm very inspired to hear from them and to see the work they're doing. Statues, when they're put up, are intended very literally to set the past in stone. And as we'll see, that very, very rarely works. So the statues we're talking about today, the form of monuments, are quite specific. They are honorific portrait statues of individuals. I put these in a separate category from sculpture, more broadly, which might encompass all sorts of works of art. Religious statuary, I also think, is another category. Now, obviously, there are large grey areas between all these separate categories. There are many, many types of monument, but these, sort of portrait statues are something quite separate. They have their own little category. I mean, here in Copenhagen, for instance, as in many cities, there are all sorts of forms of monument. We've got historical buildings, there are war memorials, commemorative plaques, graveyards. I mean, particularly the Assistance Cemetery, which is a sort of memorial cluster and attraction. But honorific portrait statues are icons of individuals, and their symbolism has a strange line-crossing place between secular and religious status. They're held to represent the individuals that they represent, but also at the same time a form of national, cultural, or community identity. Portrait statues of individuals feel to me always a bit like a sort of three-dimensional freeze frame of a moment. They will you to imagine the person they represent as a tangible human that they once were. And I think this might be one of the reasons that people react so strongly to destruction of statues. Seeing a mob smash in the face of something that looks like a person seems like an act of violence. It looks like that to us, even if in fact what is being destroyed is an object. Many cultures through history, as we know, have made statues into idols. They have bathed them and dressed them, brought them offerings, prayed to them, and so on. We don't form the same human connections with other forms of art. An obelisk or some monument does not necessarily have this same emotional pull as something with a very human appearance. So statues are this hyper-visible form of historical memory and of historical myth-making, which indeed Amalia is right that I know something about from both sides. When someone is transformed from a human into a statue, this act of memorialization tells us two stories. It tells us about who they are and who we are, and it's probably true, it's certainly possible or even likely that neither of those stories the statue tells about them or about us is true in any conventional sense. In fact, it's sometimes the case that the whole reason that the statue must be put up to tell a story is because that story is not, in fact, self-evident or accepted by a lot of people. And an example of that would be to look at the United States, a very, very large number of Confederate memorials, most of which went up between 1900 and 1920 in a period long, long after the Civil War had ended and most of the veterans were already dead. But it was a period when white supremacy was strongly reasserting itself in the South. And putting these statues up served several functions. They were a very deliberate assertion and a kind of reification and making physical of the lost cause myth, the idea that the American South had merely fought for states' rights and was, about nobility and elegance and a sort of Arthurian mythological kind of chivalry rather than about slavery. The statues also served very specifically to bond white communities together, to occupy space, to assert that this was their space, and also very deliberately to intimidate black communities, as well as intimidating anti-racist white communities as well. So these statues told a story that was neither true nor widely accepted. In fact, that's why they had to exist. Now, when we ask these questions, which come up a lot about can anybody in the present, can anyone in the past live up to the standards of the present, that question is really posed by whoever put the statue up. It's not posed by people today. The people who put the statue up, people or individual person, they are the ones who put this person on a pedestal. Now, in English, the phrase to put on a pedestal is very widely understood as to mean to be put up for uncritical worship, not for nuanced debate. Now, of course, nobody can live up to that. It's quite impossible. And of course, people will push back on this idea of that. In fact, it's really very healthy to push back on the idea that anyone is raised to the status of a sort of demigod. This constant discussion that goes into worries about, great fears about the destruction of art, which we could talk about at far, far more length, a very sensitive subject. We get constant comparisons between pulling down statues today and what ISIS and the Taliban have done recently with the Buddhas of Bamiyan or Palmyra. The destruction of art is very sensitive. It, looks very appalling to us. And I think when we kind of get into this issue, first of all, we have to differentiate that honorific portrait statues are not actually necessarily art. They're very often propaganda. Now, again, the lines may be blurred between these things, but we do have to get into a somewhat subjective take. Not all art is of absolutely equal value. And I can give you an example of how not all art is of equal value with some well-known statues. We'll start with the good. This is Bernini's bust from 1665 of Louis XIV in France. It's generally regarded as the high point of Baroque sculpture. It has the sort of extraordinary construction as you walk around it. The sort of fabric sweep seems to move. His hair is so kind of well carved. It's beautiful, beautiful portrait busts and quite extraordinary. Now, 1665, of course, the French Revolution came on, kind of 120 or so years later, and a lot of French statuary, particularly of kings, was destroyed. This bust survived Versailles, and it's still there today. And I'm very glad that this bust was not destroyed. I think it's an extremely important artistic piece. This is a portrait statue that absolutely could also be considered art. But where there is a sublime, there must also be a ridiculous. And let me introduce you, if you feast your eyes, if you have not seen, the Melania Trump statue that was put up in Slovenia in 2019. Here we go. The statue is the one on the right, just to be clear. So this was put up by an artist. This is to sort of replicate Madame Trump in the outfit she wore at her husband's inauguration. It's carved out of a linden tree, quite poorly. With a sort of blobby nose and blue paint kind of daubed on it to be her dress. Now, so put up in 2019, the local Slovenians did not embrace this statue with great love. And in fact, on the night of the 4th of July, American Independence Day in 2020, the statue was set on fire with gasoline and tires. And nobody minded at all. In fact, the artist who commissioned it was really pleased. He was interviewed by the New York Times, and he said, there's a lot of buzz around the destruction of monuments. I'm going to re-exhibit it when it's all, as a pile of ashes. So actually, destruction had given this statue a status that it previously had lacked. So we can see that there are extreme variations in the quality of statues and in what they perhaps mean. And actually, people have very, very different reactions to them. You see, you in the audience were laughing at that. You would not necessarily laugh if I showed you a picture of the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan, because you understand these things are different. They're often framed in debates as being about this cultural war, as I said, the idea of traditional versus progressive values. In 2020, this was easy to do because the attacks on statues seemed to kind of polarize people into very broadly two camps. Those who cheered on the protesters tended to be very broadly younger, more socially liberal. Those who disapproved tended broadly to be older and more conservative. But you really don't have to go back very far in history to see that this is absolutely not always the case. For instance, in the 1990s, the fall of the Soviet Union, many Western conservatives absolutely cheered when Felix Dzerzhinsky's statue or the ones of Lenin fell down. 2013 in Iraq, the giant statue of Saddam Hussein was pulled down largely by American forces under the pretense that it was Iraqis. Again, Western conservatives rejoiced, made great hay out of it on Fox News and so forth. And even much more recently, and in a place that will occupy much of our thoughts at the moment, from 2013 onwards in Ukraine, there was an extraordinary phenomenon called the Lenin Fall, when all the statues of Lenin in Ukraine were pulled down. Now, this one is perhaps worth going into a little more. We have a little picture here of, here's one of them, on its way down. Now, actually, since the fall of the Soviet Union, probably before too, Russians themselves have had quite mixed feelings about Lenin. He's not necessarily, he's certainly in Putin's kind of general conception of Russian history. Putin is much more keen on promoting the history of Stalin or the history of Nicholas II. Lenin is quite a minor figure in the Putin kind of world. And actually, many Lenin statues have been pulled down in Russia as well. But in Ukraine, Lenin had come to symbolize, again, as I say, statues often symbolize something different than they're intended to. Lenin had come to symbolize Russia and Russian imperialism. And that's because Lenin statues were placed in all Ukrainian towns and felt to them like an outsider. So the protesters in 2013 and onwards in the next few years used Lenin as really a proxy for the Ukrainian president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, who was very pro-Russian. He was a very long way from being any kind of Leninist, and that would not be remotely accurate to link him really to Lenin. But in February 2014, this phenomenon of the Lenin Fall really took off. 316 Lenins pulled down that month. In 1991, there had been an estimated 5,500 Lenin statues in Ukraine. By October 2017, they were all gone, apart from 2 which are in the Chernobyl exclusion zone and cannot be touched. You can't go there. Interestingly, now that Russian soldiers have been occupying parts of Ukraine, they have actually put some Lenin statues back up, which to me is fascinating because it means that they too are actually understanding that as a symbol of Russian imperialism. They're obviously, again, not promoting Leninism. So, the statues have become a very contested fact in the war that is going on right now from Russia and Ukraine. These waves of iconoclasm that I've mentioned do actually happen periodically all the way through history. You could look at the English Reformation or the French Revolution for examples of huge movements that have torn down lots of statues, destroyed lots of art. Colonization would also be another period where art and statues were destroyed en masse. European colonizers often destroyed art either because it was pagan or because it was valuable, such as in South America, many gold pieces of art were melted down. And even if you go back to ancient Egypt, it was extremely common for pharaohs to destroy statues of their predecessors as part of them establishing their own new regime. The Bible, in fact, mandates the destruction of statues. Deuteronomy 12, verse 3, "And you shall overthrow their altars and break their pillars and burn their groves with fire, and you shall hew down the graven images of their gods and destroy the names of them out of that place." So in fact, the history of pulling down statues is very nearly as old as the history of putting them up. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the discussion about statues is not a simple case of older conservatives like statues, young progressives don't like them. Our reactions to them depend enormously on who they commemorate, who put them up, who defends them, who pulls them down, and why. And Amalie mentioned a quote from my book earlier where I sort of went through some of these existential questions that I think they represent. Whose stories do we tell as societies? Who or what defines us? Who gets to make these decisions? And what if we don't all agree? I can tell you now that we never do. How is history made? Why and by whom? I was very struck recently to see a quote from James Baldwin, the American writer, and he wrote, "White man, hear me. History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do." So history is not just what happened in the past in a simple factual way, but the stories that we tell about ourselves. And this really manifests, I think, in statues. They are an interesting example of how the past and present talk to each other and are almost in dialogue. Now, to go back for a brief history of statues, they're much older than recorded history. They date back to the Paleolithic era. These are the oldest confirmed statues, or sort of human representations. Both are German, made of ivory, and around 35,000 to 40,000 years old. The Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel and the Venus of Hohlefels, excuse me. Statuary is a form that can be found on every inhabited continent in the world. We have the Easter Island Moai in Polynesia, the terracotta warriors of China, the Knox sculptures of Nigeria, and these wonderful colossal Olmec heads in Mexico, which, as you can see by the person standing beside this one, are really enormous and quite fantastic. But the classical style of statuary that we recognise immediately in Europe, and indeed in places that have been colonised by Europe, dates back to ancient Greece and Rome. And ancient Greece, statues could be artistic, devotional, honorific, or perhaps a mix of all the above. Communities would thank deserving individuals with what was called an icon, from which we, of course, get this word icon. It was a publicly displayed bronze or marble statue, usually. It could be a painted portrait on wood. Now, broadly, these icons began as exceptional honours that were kind of awarded by public bodies, but gradually what began to happen is that very wealthy individuals would simply put up statues of themselves and their families of their own accord, according to their own priorities. This classical tradition of statuary was revived in Europe during the Renaissance in the 15th and 16th centuries, but with an important new twist. As many of you will know, classical statues were in fact painted. But by the time the Renaissance revival came along, the paint had generally rubbed off. So there was a somewhat mistaken assumption that classical statues were in fact kind of gleaming white marble. Now, this is not irrelevant, and I know that Moving Monuments has brought this up specifically. I think it's a really important issue. The whiteness of statues itself becomes very significant. Now, statues can, of course, be made in wood, like Melania, as you've seen, bronze, all sorts of materials, dark light materials, but the classical image that people think of is generally this sort of pristine white marble or sandstone. Now, ancient statues, again, if you look at them, had all sorts of different features. In fact, many of them did represent people of African origin and so forth, but modern revivals of statuary, particularly after the Renaissance, particularly more in the 19th century, have very much centred and focused on whiteness specifically as an aesthetic. And there's a very direct line you can trace, not only in the sort of physical whiteness, but so the Apollo Belvedere, one of the most famous classical statues, was used to kind of, by physiognomists and so on, to draw up what was supposed to be a perfect formula of beauty. And later those theories were in fact picked up by the Nazis and so on. So there's a very direct correlation between these statues and the history of white supremacy and whiteness particularly. The modern tradition of honorific portrait statuary that accounts for most of the statues that now inhabit our cities was a 19th century revival of the Renaissance revival of the classical style, so several degrees of revival. And I trace it back somewhat to this man. This is the Scottish writer Thomas Carlyle. This is a statue of him, ironically, sitting in London on the Embankment. And in 1840, he published On Heroes, Hero Worship and the Heroic in History, in which he stated, "The history of the world is but the biography of great men." So this was called the great man theory of history. Now, this theory suggested that all of the twists and turns of world events could be explained by the actions of just extraordinary individuals who excelled in such things as divinity, courage, leadership, the arts, so on and so forth. His examples were all men, so we'll leave him with great men. He did include one non-European man in the form of the Prophet Muhammad. I followed suit in my book, made sure they were all men, but Saddam Hussein is in there as a non-European man. Commemoration was no longer, at this point, just for statues previously had largely been of royalty, rulers or religious figures. But in the 19th century, they started making statues of philanthropists, social reformers, inventors, cultural figures, soldiers, industrialists, all sorts of new people were put up. And the phenomenon was described at the time as statue mania, a bit like Beatlemania, but an earlier form. And it's really astonishing if you look at the numbers. So in 1870 in Paris, there were 11 public statues. But between 1870 and 1914, the beginning of World War I, another 155 statues went up. In London in 1844, there were 22 statues. 1910, there were 215. And you can run similar numbers on many European, American, and colonized cities. I would imagine the numbers would be very similar here in Copenhagen. I haven't fully totted them all up, but there are a lot of statues in this town now, and a lot of them probably date back to that 19th century period or just up to World War I. In fact, at the time, the artist Edgar Degas said that you have to put iron wire around the lawns of public gardens to prevent sculptors from depositing their works therein, as if they were dogs that were fouling the lawn. The campaigns to put these statues up in the 19th century were often driven by a zealous individual. It was often claimed that the funds to raise them was public subscription. Sometimes this was true. It very often was not true. And it was quite difficult often to persuade the public to donate money to put up a statue. Again, there were many more worthy causes around. So the zealous individuals quite often just ended up paying up for the statues themselves. I think here we will probably think of Carl Jacobsen from Carlsberg, who I believe drove a lot of this here in Denmark. Just as in ancient Greece, where icons began as public honours before wealthy individuals just took it upon themselves to put them up for their own priorities, something very similar happened in the 19th and 20th centuries. The history really sort of repeated itself in a different pattern. So I want to talk a little bit about Edward Colston, the statue in Bristol, which I think very obviously that story somewhat inspired the drowning of Frederick V here in Denmark. Now this statue, we can have it here, there is it when it was still up, was put up in Bristol in England in 1895. This was over 170 years after the death of Edward Colston. It was put up by one of these zealous individuals, a man called James Arrowsmith. Now, he was a very successful businessman in Bristol. He'd made an absolute fortune in publishing. I warn you that today you can definitely not make a fortune in publishing, but I believe in the 19th century one could. So he put up this statue of Edward Colston, who had lived from 1636 to 1721. So as I say, much, much earlier. And the reason that this statue was put up, the reason Arrowsmith was so concerned about putting it up, was actually nothing to do with Edward Colston at all, really. It was very much rooted in contemporary fears in 1895 about the rise of socialism. Now, Colston himself, of course, would have had absolutely no idea what socialism was or what it meant. He lived before the word was even coined. His history was as a slave trader, and he was quite a notable slave trader. He was deputy governor, which is effectively the CEO of the Royal African Company, which was the company, the governor was the British king at the time. It was the company with a monopoly on slave trading for Britain. But by 1895, when this statue was put up, Britain, of course, had made slavery illegal. And in fact, the British Empire had sort of fully reversed its position. British Navy was often sent against slave traders, and Britain saw slavery as abhorrent and itself as the main global opposition to slave trading. So really this kind of history of Colston's slave trading by 1895 was actually very awkward for those who wanted to put this statue up. So in fact, that history had to be erased. If we talk about erasing history, I can give you an example right here. On the statue, which you can't see in huge detail there, but you can sort of get the general idea of it, had these plaques around the bottom. And rather than, so there was one that sort of showed his seafaring trade, but rather than admitting that this was slave trading, there's a boat with a mermaid and a merman and a little dolphin, no reference to slavery at all. And when it was put up in 1895 with the ceremony in Bristol, the only way you could catch any relevance to slavery was that in the mayor's speech, there was a subclause in one sentence he said, where he said, much of Colston's trade was with the West Indies. So if you were listening very hard and you put two and two together, perhaps you could say, this was slavery, but other than that, it was not mentioned at all. The function of Colston against socialism was supposed to be that he was a great philanthropist, which indeed he was. He donated very large amounts of money to various institutions in Bristol, because he'd made a lot of money, and did not have any children. And so he was being shown by Arrowsmith and by the kind of local administration in Bristol to be an example of how you didn't need socialism. What you could have, in fact, was a virtuous individual, a patriarchal system with this man who would look after you, and he will raise the poor by funding schools and so forth. So no socialism necessary, just more rich people, that will solve matters. So that was the kind of purpose of putting it up. And actually, this became controversial again not very long afterwards. So in around 1920, there was a critical biography of Colston for the first time. It was actually not written by some kind of fire-breathing socialist, but by a reverend. There was a lot of criticism in the church at that time of slave trading. So 1920, the beginning of criticism of the statue and of Colston again in Bristol. And when people sort of thought this statue was pulled down very quickly, in fact, it took 100 years of argument after that before the statue was finally pulled down. We have a little picture here of the dramatic moment when Colston's statue fell into Bristol Harbour. I think the reporting of this incident where the statue was taken down was particularly bad because it was reported a lot in the British press as being a sort of crazed mob who pulled this statue down. But in fact, the pulling down process was clearly very thoroughly considered, and I think itself was a form of pageantry. The statue, you can see videos very easily online of the statue being pulled down. It was extremely easy to pull down. It was obviously very poorly made. It took seconds to pull the whole thing over. It was then covered in graffiti and red paint. And 2 black protesters knelt on its neck for 8 minutes, which was exactly the same amount of time, very deliberately, that the American police officer Derek Chauvin had knelt on the neck of George Floyd, whose death had triggered these Black Lives Matter protests. So that was a very deliberate piece of art that they were doing. The statue was then dragged through the streets in a sort of public progress of humiliation. And finally, this moment where it was thrown into the harbour, very deliberately recalling the 19,000 enslaved people who died aboard Edward Colston's slave ships and were thrown into the sea. I would personally say that arguably this pageant was really a far more significant work of art than the statue itself had ever been. Clearly, I think it inspired and was echoed in the drowning of Frederick V a few months later. When totalitarian regimes rose in the 20th century, they often adopted and adapted this statue trend from the 19th century to their own purposes. And particularly, this was obvious in the Soviet Union, which went in for statues with extraordinary vigour. I've written a bit particularly about the Stalin statue in Budapest, which was unveiled in 1951. Here is a picture of it at the time, with Stalin in a Hungarian transliteration beneath it. This was absolutely huge, this statue. The budget originally was 350,000 Hungarian forints. It went over budget 27 times over the original budget, so it ended up costing a lot of money. And it's a fascinating story of how putting up statues often also itself involves destruction. So to put this statue up, it's very large, as you can see. It's on the edge of the big park in Budapest, and they had to demolish a tram station, a theatre, and the Regnum Marianum church. So it's very symbolic that to accommodate Stalin, they had to destroy modernity, culture, and faith. Much of the bronze that made this statue actually came from earlier Hungarian statues that the government melted down to build this one. So once again, the destruction of those statues was part of the construction of this one. The 1956 uprising in Budapest against Soviet rule had as one of its central demands the removal of this enormous statue. And in the end, the protesters very early on in the rebellion against Soviet rule did this themselves. Now this one, unlike Colston, which as I say you can see online took about 30 seconds to pull down, this was nearly impossible, 8 meters tall, absolutely enormous, bronze, extremely solid, very difficult. I mean, it was hollow inside, but it was pretty large and heavy, so it took them forever. They had to get trucks in the end with wire cables, and eventually they had a welder going at it around its legs and all of this. And apparently there was a crowd of 100,000 people standing in the square shouting, "Come on, little Joseph, come on," and trying to get him down. And apparently when it came down, it bounced almost like a rubber ball. And we can see here it lying in the street. I'm afraid my Hungarian is nearly as bad as my Danish, but even I understand what WC on his face probably means, and I believe it was so used. Now, not all communist countries went in for this statue mania. It's quite specifically Soviet. So China, for instance, never became particularly interested in statues. There was a short burst of Chinese statues in 1967, where they put up 2,000 Mao statues over the following 2 years in various parts of China. But actually, this didn't really sit very well with the Communist Party of the time, which was then still led by Mao Zedong himself. In June 1969, they made a proclamation that such formal and pompous tributes to Mao must cease. And in 1980, after Mao's death, the government issued another instruction to end his personality cult completely, and most of these statues were taken down. I think it is thought that around 180 of the original 2,000 are still somewhere. Since the 1990s, though, as the government has gone into a new period, quite a few more have gone up. The government is still quite sensitive in China about Mao's dignity, so they actually tend to tear down the worst. And here's a really bad one, Mega Mao. This is a 36-meter gold Mega Mao in Henan. So this went up in 2016, provoking enormous amusement online. And the Chinese government was clearly really not very happy about this. So you can see in the second picture, it was draped in a black cloth and actually hacked to bits within days of being unveiled. It lasted a very, very short period of time. The far-right regimes in Europe, Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, also spent enormous sums on monuments. Mussolini put his own image absolutely everywhere in the form of statues, busts and portraits. The writer Italo Calvino remembered, "I spent the first 20 years of my life with Mussolini's face always in view." The Nazi aesthetic also included classical statues. You can see here a side-by-side comparison of the Discobolos of Myron, one of the most famous statues of the classical world, with the decathlete Erwin Huber. This is from the film Olympia, 1938 film about the Olympics, directed by Leni Riefenstahl. And you can see here he's recreating this very famous pose. But actually the Nazis didn't tend to go in for sort of full-scale statues of themselves in public places. They were more into sort of classical, revival, allegorical statues. But what they did go in for a lot were busts. So Hitler's favourite sculptor was Arno Breker, and he made busts of figures including Goebbels, Albert Speer, Hitler himself, as well as icons of the Nazi movement such as Richard Wagner. And these were mass-produced and would be displayed often in offices, factories, shops and homes. I recently was very shocked to walk into an antique shop, junk shop, in Sussex and be confronted by this, which is indeed one of these statues, a head of Hitler. So it says Alloy Adolf, £38 for sale. And I have to say, I didn't know what to do at all confronted by this. I was very offended. I also realized then the shop was selling a large amount of Third Reich memorabilia. And so I said to my husband, we're leaving right now. But then I tried to figure out I thought this object should not really be tolerated. I mean, it's legal, would not be legal in Germany, but in Britain it's legal. But it's obviously deeply distasteful. And I thought, well, I certainly wouldn't buy it because I wouldn't give the shopkeeper money. I think it would be more moral to steal it. And then I would have to destroy it somehow. But how could I destroy it? Because it's really quite hard to destroy it. That's why a lot of them are still here, is that, it's kind of a solid alloy. It would not be easy at all. And in the end, I thought, yes, I would have to probably sail a boat out, a good distance out to sea, and then throw it into the sea. That was the best I could come up with. But I'm afraid I'm not criminally inclined, and so I wussed out of stealing it. I do not have this horrible head. But they do exist still around and about. But East and West Germany both removed all Nazi statuary and symbolism and in fact criminalised any display of the swastika in 1949. Italy removed most statues and images of Mussolini himself, although anyone who's visited will know that they kept a lot of fascist art and architecture in place. From the beginning in East Germany and then somewhat later in the West too, public bodies invested very heavily in a programme of school and lifelong education aimed at denazification and really facing up to the past. The sites of concentration camps were turned into museums and memorials to the Nazis' victims, but no memorials remain to the Nazis themselves. And the result in Germany today is that the Nazi regime and its victims are very powerfully and meaningfully remembered. Germany proves that removing statues does not erase history, nor cause it to be forgotten. If anything, it may in fact have the opposite effect. So what should we do with statues that no longer represent us? We all have a number of them in European countries. My view is quite strongly that it needs to be up to the community to decide. I think the people who live around such objects have the right to decide on their own built environment and how that should be constructed. Now, of course, I'm not expecting this to be an easy agreement between anyone, but this is democracy. One has to go through these fights. And that is simply a matter for each community. They may well take different points of view. Statues don't always have to be removed in order to modify the conversation and move things along. And I wanted to share with you a few examples some of which are quite fun, of how statues have been altered or recontextualized to change their meaning. And before we go into them fully, I want to just express that the very commonly kind of suggested answer of simply putting an explanatory plaque on the statue is the most boring and least effective way to achieve this. You might remember earlier I said the writer Robert Musil's line, "There is nothing in this world as invisible as a monument. There is one thing even less visible, and that's a plaque on the bottom of a monument." And to illustrate this, I can show you a rather extraordinary statue. You'll have to, honestly, this one really exists. This is obviously a bust of Joseph Stalin that went up, believe it or not, in Bedford, Virginia, United States in 2010. Now, the reason the bust of Stalin was raised is that somebody in Virginia had the bright idea of doing a series of busts of Allied leaders in World War II. So they had, Churchill, Roosevelt, Truman, and Stalin. I mean, it's accurate. But they put this up, and now they weren't, they did realize that this would be quite controversial. So they put a plaque on the Stalin one saying, really bad guy, killed lots of people, really, huge death toll, all of this, explaining everything. What can I say? Nobody reads the footnotes. It has, in fact, caused enormous offence very quickly, and it had to be taken down very quickly within a couple of months of going up. It has not reappeared. It's now gone. So, the plaques do not work. It's a very boring way to do it. I mean, after the Edward Colston statue came down, there were a lot of journalists in London, not in Bristol, asking, could they not have just put a plaque on the statue? Well, in fact, the possibility of putting a plaque on that statue had been causing absolutely enraged discussion in Bristol for 10 years, with lots of arguments and counter-arguments about the wording, and it was never even done. So instead of adding footnotes to statues, which, as I say, doesn't work, I'm very much more interested in the people around the world who've embraced much more creative interventions. This extraordinary statue used to be a standard formal statue of the dictator Alfredo Stroessner in Paraguay. The artist Carlos Colombino broke it into pieces and rearranged them and squished them between two concrete blocks. So I think that's rather a clever reuse of a statue. It now stands as a memorial to Stroessner's victims, and I think is really very effective. This is a proposal from another artist, Manfred Butzmann in Germany, who wanted, with the statue of Lenin in Berlin, to plant ivy all around it so that it would be slowly and gradually swallowed up by nature. This was not done, but again, I think it's a very interesting proposal for how you might deal with a statue. You can also make temporary modifications to statues with paint, props, light projection, or wool. Yarn bombing, as it is known, is a way of altering certain statues. This is the statue of Rocky, the fictional boxer from the Sylvester Stallone movie, which is outside the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The artist Jessie Hemmons felt that this statue was a little bit touristy. So in 2010, she knitted him a pink sweater, which has the words, "Go see the art," on it. So there's a modification that doesn't cause any damage. There was actually also such a modification on the Edward Colston statue in Bristol for a while. Somebody knitted a bright red ball and chain around its feet, dangling down the plinth, which again I thought was a very clever intervention, very interesting. Now, of course, paint can also be used. So same year, 2011, a graffiti artist transformed a bas-relief of soldiers on the Soviet Army Memorial in Sofia, Bulgaria. You can see it above and below. And with some rather clever paintwork, this has turned these Soviet soldiers into Superman, Father Christmas, Ronald McDonald, the Joker. I think Captain America might be in there, various figures, and have been sort of brought out with paint. The paint was then removed, but I mean, it's quite a creative way of approaching it. Again, we're seeing now Soviet army memorials coming down all over Eastern Europe. In Poland, they've been taking lots of them down since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this is happening again. During the coronavirus pandemic in 2020, 2021, hundreds of statues around the world briefly acquired face masks. I saw them on a lot of them. And a full light projection in Rio de Janeiro on the enormous Christ the Redeemer statue transformed it into a doctor with a stethoscope, which was really rather beautiful. You can also go in for very radical transformations. I'm going to give you another example from Ukraine during the Lenin fall in 2014. This is a statue of Lenin that stood in Odessa, which an artist transformed very impressively with titanium alloy cladding into a recreation of Darth Vader with the billowing cloak Lenin's coat becoming this kind of coat. I believe it also had Wi-Fi installed, so very useful as well as beautiful. What more could we want than Darth Lenin? I think it has now gone. I mean, Odessa is obviously now a contested space. A fallen statue itself can be a powerful symbol that tells us a historical story, and there's a strong argument, I think, for keeping it that way. The French conceptual artist Daniel Buren asked a wonderful question: does a statue lying flat, for example, one that is knocked down during a revolution, automatically become a sculpture, a piece of art? Now, after the 1966 coup in Ghana that overthrew the first Prime Minister, Kwame Nkrumah, his images and works were banned and his statue in Accra was beheaded. The statue's head was retrieved by a member of the public and hidden for a long time. In 2009, a very different political climate, it was returned. And now, the statue and its head are exhibited, as you can see, side by side in Kwame Nkrumah Memorial Park in Accra. And I think this is actually, again, very clever. Rather than restoring the head, now the head and the statue tell us stories not only about Kwame Nkrumah, but about the coup that removed him, the violence that forced him out. So actually, again, this statue has become more interesting by its vandalism and by the way it is now displayed. It's really now telling a much more complicated historical story. Should we, as is often raised, again, move statues we don't want to museums? Now, I know we have some museum people in the audience tonight. All I can say is the curators I know put their heads in their hands and groan when this is suggested, because statues are often enormous, very physically large. Museums do not have space for all these unwanted statues in their collections, and often the statues simply don't reflect the collection of that particular museum. I think perhaps better solutions that could be looked for are kind of dedicated spaces, and often these can be outdoor. We have seen outdoor sculpture parks for unwanted statues arise in Delhi, in Moscow, in Budapest, in lots of places around the world. I visited a number of them. The Delhi one is sort of fascinatingly neglected. The statues are unmarked. Some of them are used as cricket stumps. People sit on them and kind of smoke cigarettes and take selfies. Very overgrown. The one in Budapest is incredibly beautifully curated, very well kept. It's called Memento Park, and has been designed, very much as a park to contain those statues. And I think both of those parks tell different but fascinating stories about how we approach history. I think this could be a wonderful solution for many countries that are now sort of wondering what they do with these statues, certainly in the US, the UK, maybe even here in Denmark. And perhaps the most extraordinary of all these unwanted sculpture parks, statue graveyards, they're sometimes called, is sadly at the moment unvisitable, but it's in Crimea, and it's actually underwater. So a large number of old communist statues were taken by a diver and placed on the seabed in Crimea. So you could, at times not of war, visit this if you were a diver, but only if you were a diver. I think this remarkable sort of image here of this is Lenin and Karl Marx being gradually swallowed up by barnacles, and the ocean. You can see in the background various other figures, sort of almost as if in conversation, being sort of taken over by seaweed. And, the image immediately brings to mind kind of Atlantis and destroyed civilizations and all sorts of things. The symbolic drowning, of course, of Edward Colston or Frederick V would also relate to this story. A statue submerged is a very powerful symbol. I think this is a fascinating way to take it. Here in Denmark, of course, there is the Lapidarium of Kings. We've heard about it already. The 384 statues removed from their context, currently placed in sort of storage at the Christian IV brew house. I know that the ambition of moving monuments is to do something with this, to turn it into a research laboratory, promoting understanding and discussion about art, colonialism, public sculpture. I think that's a really wonderful idea. And for statues where there are difficult questions of not being able to move them, I think, then creative solutions are called for as well. There's a very ongoing debate in Oxford about the Cecil Rhodes statue in Oriel College in the university, which is very controversial. The college is currently claiming that it's very difficult to remove because this facade is listed, partly because the statue is so controversial and interesting, so it has special protection. I've suggested that they simply hang a red light opposite and project it onto his hands. At least that would acknowledge it. Instead, of course, they've put a plaque on it. I mean, really. It's not even a good plaque. It's actually just on a notice board, like a sandwich shop. It's pathetic. Anyway. What should go, we're bound to have to ask also what should go in the place of all these fallen statues. You know, since 2020, many of our countries have empty plinths sitting around, and there is some discussion about what we should do instead. Particularly now, again, the sort of suggestion that often comes up is, we need more statues of women, more people of colour. I am not excited by that possibility. And the reason is because I do trace this tradition of statuary that we're rejecting back to the great man theory of history. I think it's the great man theory of history, the idea of one individual driving and creating history is inherently patriarchal. And it's, you know, so I think if we want to come at this from a sort of feminist or anti-racist point of view, we can't just have tokenistic representation. We have to challenge that form. I think that, you know, a much more radical solution would be interesting. I think statues themselves are part of the problem. They are inherently didactic, they're haughty, they're uninvolving. And as we've seen, they have a regrettable history of links with tyranny and indeed white supremacy. I think it's very hard to get away from that. And if we want to think about more representative forms of memorial, I think we could look much more at collective memorials. A very obvious example, of which you have many here, are war memorials, which are often, I think, very moving, which tend to be dedicated to a whole group of soldiers rather than to one individual. And we can see that those are often very venerated by their communities. We've also got some fantastic creative modern examples of memorials. I'll show you a couple. This is in Budapest again, the Danube shoes. These bronze shoes on the side of the Danube, they're just outside the Parliament building, mark the place where Jews were ordered to take their shoes off before being shot and thrown into the river by the Nazi-adjacent regime. And it's quite astonishing if you've been there. When you walk along, you can, of course, completely miss this memorial. It's extremely subtle. But if you do see it, it's absolutely electric. I mean, I find that just, you know, your skin prickles because you could almost put your feet in them. They're the same size. And so immediately it puts you in the event. When you remove this individual from the memorial, you as the viewer become the protagonist. So this installation is very clever. It connects you to the event very directly, very personally. And I think there are also ways to commemorate individuals as well, while maintaining a wider view of history. A clear example, the Stolpersteine, which I'm sure some people will have come across, the stumbling stones that began in 1992 by the German artist Günter Demnig. There are now 75,000 of these all over Europe, including, I believe, since 2019, some in Denmark. As well. So these are tiny bronze plaques in the pavement which record victims of the Nazi Holocaust. So they have the person's name, their date and what happened to them, as much as is known, can be put in the pavement. And again, I think it's quite extraordinary in that you can be walking along the street, particularly in a place like Berlin, and you almost don't notice, but when you notice them, you can look down the street and suddenly you see that there are hundreds. And so it really gives you that sense of the appalling scale of the atrocity, but also with the individual story very accessible. So it's very clever, it works on both levels. While it is important as well for us as communities to remember trauma, war and genocides, we can also, of course, memorialise joy. We can memorialise positive things. I think some of the most uplifting monuments are those to liberations, community spirit, scientific breakthroughs, artistic triumphs and so on. The Statue of Liberty in New York symbolised freedom. The Eiffel Tower in Paris symbolised the age of science, engineering, industry. Mannequin Peace in Brussels symbolises the city's rebellious sense of humour. And of course, here you have the Little Mermaid, you know, the racist fish. I mean, you know, we can debate the exact symbolism of that statue, but I think the intention was about cultural heritage and beauty and so forth. So, you know, statues don't always have to be, memorials don't always have to be to horror. They can be to joy. And I think an outstanding modern example is in England, is the Angel of the North, which is by the sculptor Anthony Gormley outside Gateshead in the north of England in 1998. It's made of rusting steel. It's raised on a mound of destroyed pithead baths from a nearby coal mine. So the coal mines, of course, in the UK were all very controversially shut down, and it's spreading its wings as if to take flight. So it gives you a sense that it's rooted in a history of pain, but with hope for the future. I think that's really far more uplifting and memorable than yet another honorific portrait statue of a local dignitary, however marvellous they may have been. And of course, we don't always need to memorialise through objects. We can also remember and commemorate or celebrate, depending on the past, our past, through festivals, museums, exhibitions, books, documentaries, performance, all of the creative arts. And in fact, we're doing it here today, really, to begin the discussion. And these forms of commemoration engage people, allowing space for them to participate, which statues do not, and they bring history to life. I want to finish by saying that I think for those of us who care about history, about art, about historical memory, about public sculpture and so forth, this moment is actually an opportunity since the iconoclasm of 2020. These controversies over statues have shed light on how public historical memory and public space is constructed and how it can be challenged. They've brought many more people into the historical debate. There is new interest. I mean, an example again would be in Bristol. There's now so much more discussion about Edward Colston. You can see his statue in the museum. They're having events. You know, the statue is now, well, it's currently actually in storage, but it was displayed on its side, still covered in paint. Really much more interesting, again, than the original statue. I want to keep opening this historical debate up, and I hope that as historians, as people who work in museums, as art historians and so on, we can really help to create and inform a much wider and more thoughtful engagement with the past publicly. And having an informed debate means taking public history out of the clutches of people who try to weaponize it for political purposes, and that's true on any side. It means not constantly going to the kind of discussions that happen in the media about binaries that really reflect our feelings today. Do we have pride or shame in our history? Was this figure good or bad? Were they a hero or a villain? You know, we do not have to discuss on these axes. We can instead ask questions about how and why things happened and, you know, really open that up rather than making it all about value judgments. This means teaching history through argument and critical thinking, trying to understand it rather than just use it for a political purpose, whatever that may be. And informing the debate like this, I think, opens up a thrilling panorama of history that isn't about us or our feelings, but about the complicated, messy, fascinating human beings who lived through it. It's a hugely rewarding job, which many historians, teachers, museum curators, documentary filmmakers, academics are already doing. And as I say, we're all participating in it right now. Now, of course, communities can keep statues they love, and of course they don't have to keep statues that they don't. And of course they will keep changing their minds. I've looked at many cases of statues that have gone up, come down, gone back up again, come down again, been moved back somewhere else, been altered, restored, changed. Every generation will keep reassessing its own relationship with the past and with the stories it tells. The way in which, as going back to James Baldwin's quote, history is present in all that we do. And I think that's very healthy. When we consider how to memorialise our history now, we have a chance to think creatively beyond the great men into a past and a future of unlimited possibilities. Thank you very much.